Darcy, the male protagonist with a net worth of over 100 million, suddenly proposed to Elizabeth, who was shocked. Darcy said, "I love you." You should know that Darcy not only owns a magnificent manor, but also millions of acres of forests and lakes. The collections in his home are countless, and his wealth is inestimable. Unexpectedly, after Darcy's sincere confession, he was rejected by Elizabeth. Elizabeth not only scolded him, but also said angrily that even if all the men in the world died, I would not marry you. These words cooled Darcy's hot heart, and he could only leave sadly. Unexpectedly, he appeared again at night. He didn't say much, but just hoped to use a letter to resolve the misunderstanding between the two. It was not until she finished reading the letter that Elizabeth regretted it. This was originally a good marriage, but because of one arrogant nature and one prejudiced, they missed each other. However, it is not easy to save this relationship. It requires not only changes in both parties, but also a miracle from God. This is the timeless classic, Pride and Prejudice, although it has been 200 years. But its realistic thinking about love and family, as well as its keen insight into human weaknesses, still inspire countless audiences today. The story of the two people starts with a dance party. The dance party was very lively that night. Accompanied by cheerful dance music, the guests danced in pairs. At this time, 3 unique guests came in at the door, and their aura instantly stunned the people at the scene. The 3 were Darcy, Bingley, and his sister Caroline. Compared with the cheerful and enthusiastic Bingley, Darcy seemed out of place here. Although he was handsome and owned half of Derbyshire, his indifference and arrogance discouraged everyone. Elizabeth's mother couldn't wait to drag her daughter and flattered them to introduce herself. As she wished, Bingley soon noticed the eldest sister Jane. Jane was beautiful and dignified, and she was particularly dazzling in the crowd. Bingley was humorous, knowledgeable, and friendly. They fell in love with each other at first sight. Darcy was expressionless all the time, neither drinking nor talking to others. Elizabeth wanted to invite him to dance, but he refused bluntly. Bingley thought Elizabeth was very cute and wanted to match them up, but Darcy said she was okay, but not beautiful enough to move my heart. These words were overheard by Elizabeth, who was sitting next to them. She smiled as if she didn't care, and at this moment she had no good impression of Darcy. Therefore, when they talked about what can inspire love, Elizabeth replied meaningfully that dancing, even if the other person looks okay. This was not only a satire on Darcy's ungentlemanly talk behind her back, but also a hint that he had missed her heart. But what Elizabeth didn't know was that Darcy's eyes followed her all night. This girl had a proud look in her eyes, without any flattery or flattery. She was like a wild lily growing freely, completely different from the delicate rose in the greenhouse. Darcy said that he didn't care, but he couldn't control his throbbing heart. That night, the two sisters chatted in bed. Elizabeth felt that her marriage must not be influenced by money. Elizabeth would only marry for true love, so she would probably end up alone. Jane was very moved by Bingley, but she didn't know what Bingley meant. Unexpectedly, the next day, Jane received a letter from Caroline. Inviting Jane to dinner at home was too obvious a hint. The whole family was overjoyed, especially the mother. They had a total of 5 daughters. Among them, the eldest daughter Jane is the most beautiful. Now, a rich and affectionate Bingley has fallen from the sky. How can the mother not fantasize about this excellent son-in-law and want to take this excellent son-in-law for herself? At this time, the mother heard the thunder outside the window and immediately came up with an inappropriate idea. The mother asked Jane to go on horseback instead of taking a carriage. In the end, the mother's arrangement achieved the expected effect. Jane caught a cold because of the heavy rain and could not go home, so she could only recuperate at Bingley's house. The mother was complacent when she heard the news, but she didn't care about her daughter's illness. Elizabeth couldn't blame her mother's calculations. Now there was no horse and no carriage. Even if she walked, Elizabeth had to visit the sick Jane, but when she arrived in a dusty state. Unexpectedly, she met Darcy and Caroline in the front hall. Darcy seemed a little nervous when he suddenly saw Elizabeth, but this time his tone was much softer than before. He was so focused on looking at Elizabeth's back that he didn't even hear Caroline's ridicule about the mud on Elizabeth's skirt, seeing that her loved one Jane was in much better condition. Bingley insisted on waiting for Jane to recover before leaving. This made Elizabeth feel a little relieved. So, Elizabeth decided to stay here. During the time as a guest, Elizabeth saw that Caroline was very interested in Darcy. Either she was around him, or she took the initiative to talk to Darcy, but Darcy always seemed very impatient. However, when he looked at Elizabeth, his eyes were full of sincerity and expectation. Caroline invited Elizabeth to get up and take a walk together and kept inviting Darcy to follow. Darcy not only refused, but also revealed that the two might be trying to show off their elegance. If this is the case, it is better to sit and enjoy it. Elizabeth was obviously unhappy when she heard this. Elizabeth responded with a hint of sarcasm, saying that Darcy was too arrogant and further questioned whether such pride was a virtue or a defect. Darcy replied that it was not certain, and if someone offended me, I would never forget it. Elizabeth smiled and said, "It seems that I can no longer make fun of Mr. Darcy." But this made Darcy unable to concentrate on writing. Until the day she returned home, Elizabeth was about to get on the carriage, but was surprised to find that Darcy was gently supporting her hand. Elizabeth was also surprised and speechless, and Darcy's heart was also excited because of this brief touch. That night, Elizabeth's home welcomed an uninvited guest because they only had 5 sisters and no brothers. According to the British law at that time, after their father died, all the family property would be inherited by this cousin, and they could even be driven out of the house. But this cousin was a person who liked to speak and act in a pretentious manner, and Elizabeth's family didn't like him very much. But they were afraid of offending this heir, so they could only deal with him as much as possible. But Elizabeth didn't buy it, and her cousin's hypocrisy was satirized by her without any hesitation. The purpose of the cousin's visit this time was to choose one of the 5 sisters as a wife. In this way, their family's property would not fall into the hands of others. In the eyes of the cousin, this was both a compensation and a grace for them. The cousin fell in love with Jane, but when he learned that Jane already had a lover, so he could only turn his target to Elizabeth, who was a lower grade, and his mother also agreed to this marriage. Soon after, Bingley prepared to hold a dance party at the manor. On this day, the 5 sisters went to the street to choose ribbons for the dance, but they unexpectedly met an army lieutenant. The man was tall and handsome, generous and humorous. The sisters were fascinated by him. The sisters also liked him very much. They walked and talked together. When they passed a river, they happened to meet Bingley and Darcy on the other side of the river. Bingley enthusiastically invited the lieutenant to join the dance, but Darcy seemed to hate this man and turned away as soon as he saw him. This surprised Elizabeth. What happened between the two? After Darcy left, Elizabeth asked the lieutenant a little and he told her everything. It turned out that the lieutenant's father was the butler of the Darcy family. Darcy's father treated the lieutenant as his own son. Before he died, he promised the lieutenant a pastor position, but Darcy ignored his father's last wish. The lieutenant thought that Darcy was jealous of him, which made Elizabeth have a serious prejudice against Darcy. On the day of the dance, Elizabeth dressed up and was confident that she could win the heart of the lieutenant. But she wandered around in the crowd for a long time, but she couldn't find the shadow of the lieutenant. It is said that he didn't attend the dance to avoid Darcy, which made Elizabeth even more dissatisfied with Darcy. Just at this time, Darcy took the initiative to invite Elizabeth to dance. She was very annoyed that she agreed to Darcy because of her nervousness. Elizabeth originally planned to finish the dance in silence, but suddenly felt that it would be good to have a chance to question him face to face. As soon as Elizabeth opened her mouth, she seemed to have determined that it was all Darcy's fault. Darcy was furious at her sarcastic tone. The two stopped dancing at the same time and stared at each other tightly. The anger was mixed with tenderness, making both of them a little confused. After the dance, Elizabeth's cousin saw Darcy. Darcy's Aunt Lady Catherine de Bourgh was his sponsor, so he had to try his best to please her. But in the eyes of outsiders, his already short stature looked even more humble and ridiculous. At the same time, except for Jane and Elizabeth, their family behaved frivolously and ugly at the dance. The mother was drunk, and the sisters were hooking up with the rich and powerful. That night, their family seemed to have made an appointment to make a fool of themselves, and all of this was seen by Caroline and Darcy. But Bingley didn't care about any of this, because his attention was all attracted by Jane. Jane also loved Bingley, but she was a shy and reserved girl who was not good at expressing her inner feelings. But in the eyes of outsiders, they all thought Jane was deliberately playing with Bingley. Caroline was particularly concerned about her family's bloodline and face, and she looked down on Elizabeth's family. So, taking advantage of Darcy's recent visit to his sister Georgiana, he forced his brother to leave here and go to London. She also wrote a letter to Jane asking her to give up the idea as soon as possible. Jane never expressed her opinion, and Bingley was not sure about her mind. In the end, he could only leave in despair. On the other hand, Elizabeth's cousin was not idle either. At breakfast that day, he suddenly sent everyone away and presented a small wild flower picked by the roadside. Then he knelt down to propose to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth rejected him seriously without any fluctuations in her heart. To the eavesdroppers, it seemed like Elizabeth humiliated her cousin. The mother quickly stepped forward to stop Elizabeth and ordered her to marry her cousin, otherwise she would sever the mother-daughter relationship with him. However, Elizabeth remained unmoved and insisted on her own opinion. The mother had no choice but to call Elizabeth's father to deal with the matter. Elizabeth's father, who knew Elizabeth, said that she had to break off relations with one of her parents today. If you don't marry your cousin, your mother will break off relations with you. But if you marry him, I will break off relations with you. As soon as this was said, her mother almost fainted on the spot. In the end, her mother had no choice but to allow her daughter to marry freely. After solving her own problems, Elizabeth began to help her sister regain her love. She believed that Bingley's feelings for her sister were true. She packed her sister's luggage and encouraged her to go to her uncle's house in London. As long as Bingley knew that her sister followed him to London, he would definitely go to find her, and so Jane left the town. Life at home returned to peace again. Elizabeth was swinging on a swing, and she could remember the dance that night as soon as she closed her eyes. Her fingertips still vaguely retained the warmth of that man, but as soon as she opened her eyes, that night seemed like a dream. That day, her bestie told Elizabeth that she was going to marry her cousin, and Elizabeth found it incredible. Because her cousin was a ridiculous person, she would definitely be unhappy. But she was satisfied with this. For a 27-year-old girl, she felt that it was good to have a comfortable home. She did not expect the ideal love in Elizabeth's heart. Seeing her leaving, Elizabeth felt conflicted and confused. She hoped that women would not marry men they did not love for money. But she could only stick to herself and could not convince others. Not long after, Elizabeth was invited to the home of the newlyweds. It happened that Lady Catherine de Bourgh, the sponsor of her cousin, held a banquet. Here Elizabeth met Darcy again. It was reasonable for Darcy to appear at her aunt's house. But the moment the two met, they were still a little surprised. Lady Catherine de Bourgh was elegant and noble, but domineering. At dinner, she saw Darcy and Elizabeth talking for a few words. She interrupted them rudely and then aggressively asked Elizabeth about her culture, age, and the reason for going out for a blind date. Elizabeth was neither humble nor arrogant, but she didn't expect the other party to push her too far. Unable to bear it any longer, Elizabeth hit back rudely. Lady Catherine de Bourgh was shocked, and others obeyed her orders. Unexpectedly, this child from an ordinary family did not bow to her power. Elizabeth's advance and retreat were measured, and Darcy saw it. After dinner, Lady Catherine de Bourgh asked Elizabeth to play the piano again. Although Elizabeth was not good at playing the piano, she reluctantly sat down to make a fool of herself under the pressure of the situation. At this time, Darcy came to the piano and whispered to Elizabeth, "I didn't dance with you when we first met just because I was introverted." Unable to have a good chat with someone he just met for the first time, Elizabeth meaningfully suggested to him that he should listen to his aunt's advice. The next day, Darcy suddenly came to visit him. He was at a loss and hesitated. Finally, after hesitating for a long time, he could only say that the house was pretty. Elizabeth responded politely and wanted to ask him to sit down and have a good chat. Unfortunately, the cousin and his wife came back at this time, and Darcy had to run away quickly. Only Elizabeth was left with a confused look on her face. In fact, after a few days of getting along, the relationship between the two had eased. Unexpectedly, Darcy's companion's unintentional words pushed the relationship between the two to the freezing point again. It turned out that Darcy had interfered and ruined the marriage of Bingley and his sister not long ago. The reason was that they did not look so well matched. At this moment, Elizabeth was filled with grief and anger, and she almost couldn't suppress her anger and ran out of the church in the rain. She came to hide under a roof, but Darcy chased her in the rain. Darcy said he came here just to meet Elizabeth. In the past, Darcy was hindered by reason and family and did not express his feelings to Elizabeth, who was much different in status. Now Darcy is willing to put it all aside and ask to marry Elizabeth, but Elizabeth rejected Darcy mercilessly. Because Darcy's words hit her self-esteem hard, Darcy actually said that liking Elizabeth was against reason. He also condescendingly criticized Elizabeth's humble background. Elizabeth asked Darcy whether it was true that her sister and Bingley were separated. Darcy did not deny this matter. He said that he did this because it was a marriage for profit. Elizabeth felt that her family was insulted, and then she told Darcy about the lieutenant being betrayed by Darcy to see how he would make excuses. Darcy was too annoyed to answer, and the two could not put aside their pride and prejudice, so they quarreled. In the end, they parted unhappily. After the two calmed down, Darcy wrote a letter to explain the previous things. In fact, after Darcy's father died, it was the lieutenant himself who refused the priesthood. Then he asked Darcy for the equivalent of £30,000 and squandered it in a few weeks. He was a shameful liar who even cheated Georgiana. As for breaking up his sister and Bingley, Darcy felt that as Bingley's friend, he had an obligation to make such a reminder. Elizabeth unconsciously read the letter over and over again. At this time, Elizabeth realized that she had misunderstood Darcy. She had always thought that Darcy was arrogant and rude, but she was also prejudiced. Not long after, Elizabeth returned home listlessly. At this time, her uncle had already sent her sister back. She didn't know how to tell her sister that it was her family's negligence that made her miss a good marriage. The two sisters were still wild and crazy, clamoring to go to the militia to find young officers all day long, and her mother just indulged them. Elizabeth hurriedly begged her father to stop them. If the sisters were so wild and unrestrained, they would definitely bring shame to the whole family. However, her father laughed it off, and she suddenly felt discouraged. After thinking about it, she decided to go out with her uncle and aunt to travel and relax. Since you can't control others, let the beauty of nature dispel your tiny troubles. Elizabeth stood on the cliff and looked into the distance. The wind in the valley blew up her long skirt and also blew the girl's tangled and bitter heart. Just when she thought she would never meet Darcy again, her uncle planned to visit Darcy Manor. Elizabeth instinctively wanted to refuse, but her uncle said that people like them would not stay at home all day. Then they came to Darcy's manor. Looking at the luxurious castle surrounded by blue sky, clear water, and green trees, Elizabeth smiled self-deprecatingly. The servant said that Darcy was not at home, but the castle was open to the public and they could visit at will. Elizabeth strolled in the exhibition hall, and the art here fascinated her. Elizabeth stared for a long time, thinking that she almost became the hostess here. She couldn't help but feel mixed emotions in her heart. At this time, Elizabeth's impression of Darcy was completely different. His love made her grateful, and his personality made her respect. If there was no previous misunderstanding, what would their relationship be like? While she was in a daze, she suddenly heard a sound of piano, and Elizabeth was attracted to it involuntarily. She guessed that it should be Georgiana playing the piano, but she didn't expect Darcy to be there and found Elizabeth peeking at the side. Elizabeth left in a hurry, and when Darcy caught up with her, Elizabeth said that she thought Darcy was not at home. The two didn't know what topic to talk about for a while, and the scene was very awkward. Darcy offered to take her home, but Elizabeth smiled and refused. When she returned to the hotel, she learned that Darcy personally invited them to visit tomorrow, and his uncle and aunt praised him highly. Elizabeth couldn't help but feel secretly proud in her heart. The next day, Elizabeth came to Darcy Manor again, and when they met again, they put away their arrogance and prejudice. Georgiana was also very friendly to her future sister-in-law, but the good time only lasted for one day. A letter in the evening completely broke their peace. It turned out that the former lieutenant had kidnapped the youngest sister and eloped. This incident would become a scandal and endanger the reputation of the entire family. With such disappointment in the family, his fate with Darcy was over. Darcy's tone contained sympathy, but also a bit of restraint. That night, the uncle ended his journey and rushed back to London to find someone with his father. And Elizabeth went home sadly to comfort her mother who was bedridden. The whole family knew that the family's reputation had been ruined, and the remaining daughters were afraid that no one would want them anymore. But just when everyone was anxious, things suddenly took a turn for the better. The uncle wrote to inform that not only had the younger sister been found, but she had also married the lieutenant. When the mother heard the news, she immediately sat up from the bed with joy. Without time to wash, she couldn't help but tell the news to the neighbors. The father thought that the uncle must have given the lieutenant enough money to complete the wedding. But when her sister came home, Elizabeth knew that it was Darcy who had gone to great lengths to find them. He also provided them with wedding funds and huge living expenses. Elizabeth listened silently, with mixed feelings in her heart. Not long after, Darcy brought Bingley to visit here again, and the women who were living their daily lives were panicked when they heard the news. Elizabeth saw the two from the window and hurriedly asked her sisters to tidy up the room. When the two came to the door of the room was already quiet and harmonious. Bingley came specifically for Jane, and he asked for a separate meeting to let others leave. Then Bingley knelt down on one knee to propose to Jane, and Jane was very moved and married him. After twists and turns, This pair of unfortunate lovers finally got married. Looking at her happy sister, Elizabeth was both happy and disappointed, because the person she was looking forward to did not come. Late that night, there was a sudden knock on the door. The person who came was the noble Lady Catherine de Bourgh. She asked to talk to Elizabeth alone with a cold face, and then insulted and abused Elizabeth. Lady Catherine believed that Elizabeth's family was humble and there was a scandal of elopement. So Lady Catherine would never allow her nephew Darcy to do anything that would tarnish the family's reputation. Elizabeth was not afraid of power. Not only did she refuse the request, but she also sent the guest away directly. Elizabeth did not sleep all night that night and went out to relax before dawn the next day. She was walking alone in the field, and suddenly there was a sound of shallow footsteps in the distance in the silence. I saw a man coming in the morning mist. His hair was covered with dew, and his clothes were slightly open. It turned out that Lady Catherine de Bourgh wanted to break them up, but it backfired. Let them understand each other's intentions. This time, the arrogant man put down all his arrogance and sought this love with a humble attitude. Elizabeth was also very guilty. She put down all her prejudices and sincerely thanked Darcy for everything he had done for her. The two looked at each other for a long time, and Darcy slowly spoke. "If you choose to refuse, I will no longer pester you, but if you agree, we will never separate from now on." In the morning sunshine, Elizabeth held Darcy's hand and kissed it deeply. The love hidden in her eyes is the best answer. Afterwards, Elizabeth told her father what happened just now. Her father reminded Elizabeth that Darcy was an arrogant person and would not necessarily be happy if he continued like this. "But if you're sincere, I have no opinion." Then, Elizabeth explained everything to him recently, and her father's expression became relieved after learning the truth. In the end, the two got their ideal love. Love is revealed in the twilight every day. Pride and Prejudice is directed by Joe Wright, starring Keira Knightley and Matthew Macfadyen, a romantic film released in 2005. This film is adapted from the novel of the same name by Jane Austen. Elizabeth originally fell in love with Darcy at first sight, but because she didn't know his character, she mistakenly thought that he was an arrogant man. Coupled with a series of misunderstandings afterwards, Elizabeth's prejudice against Darcy gradually deepened. When Darcy finally plucked up the courage to confess to Elizabeth, she hurt Darcy's sincerity with the most sharp words. Fortunately, Darcy is a real gentleman. After learning that there was a misunderstanding between the two, he took the initiative to explain the whole story. It's just that at this time, one of them didn't dare to take the initiative because of guilt, and the other didn't dare to continue after being rejected. Even if they have confirmed their inner feelings, they can only let this relationship go away. But how can two people who really love each other easily get separated? Because as long as there is a little room for maneuver, they can't help but run towards each other madly. And Darcy is a man who is extremely determined in his feelings, so when he learned that there was a little hope. Darcy, who has always been gentlemanly and polite, didn't even put on his clothes and came to Elizabeth overnight. The two did not miss each other because of this. In addition to infidelity and betrayal, the most taboo in love is to refuse to communicate. Many times, misunderstandings arise because everyone only looks at things from their own perspective and believes in their own judgment. As a result, the trivial things that could be explained in a few words have become a sharp blade that destroys the relationship between the two. Well, today's movie sharing ends here. Welcome everyone to like, comment, and forward thank you for your patience in watching. Looking forward to meeting you next time.